special privilege and thrill for us to be able to speak to you, albeit online. So welcome to you, and thank you for agreeing to be with us.
Thank you, Ian. Great to be with you, albeit in this case I'm in London this morning, but normally in New York, and would have loved to have been there in person. Certainly my relationship with Charles goes back longer than he probably knows, because I worked during a few summers at Potter Partners when I was at law school. And then I got to know him as I was applying to Columbia Business School, and very much enjoyed his company over the years. He's a great man.
Thank you. Yes, well, he's been very generous to our institution, the Melbourne Business School, over many years, one of the founders, in fact, of the school. So let's make a start, James. Perhaps we could begin with your personal story. I mean, it's one that many people admire greatly, because you're a boy from Melbourne, and you've become the chairman and CEO of Morgan Stanley in New York. You've risen enormously over that career, having started with an arts law degree at the university here at Melbourne. And I understand that you then, as it were, backed yourself, borrowed money and took yourself to New York to do an MBA at Columbia University. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about that journey, just to kick us off?
Sure. Well, I'll try and be brief. I grew up in Melbourne. I loved it and had a great life, great family there. Most of them still there. I have an enormous family of 10 children. I don't have 10 children, but I'm one of 10 children. And many of us, a number of us, went to Melbourne University. I think 5 of the 10 maybe. So pretty deep relationships. My father went there, and various other family members. So, but I'd worked as a lawyer for 4 years after graduating from law school, and I really wanted to be in business. And at that time, it was difficult to make the transition. The business schools in Australia, I don't even know if Melbourne School might have just started that year,
right,
around 1985.
Oh, yeah.
AGSM had been around a couple of years.
Yep.
So I thought I'd go to the US and attend business school and learn a little bit about finance. And I'd taken some courses at the Stock Exchange in Melbourne, and basically got a security certification of some kind. Worked, as I said, at Potter Partners in the summer. So I was interested in finance, I was interested in the markets, and I thought it would be very difficult to make the transition from law directly. So the beauty of going to business school, as you all know, Ian, and all your students are fortunate to have the opportunity to sort of recreate themselves, if that's their desire, by taking on courses they didn't have before. So that was that's the short background. I mean, it was really a question of backing yourself. I borrowed at what most people would consider highly punitive interest rates. I think I borrowed at 24%.
Whoa.
Which everybody thought was crazy, and I thought I was lucky, because I was getting to go to study and launch a different kind of career. I had no idea where it'd end up, and had no expectation, honestly, but that I would throw myself into the business world and see what came of it.
Terrific. Well, you had such a distinguished career at many of the top advisory and financial institutions in the US, including McKinsey and Merrill Lynch, before, of course, Morgan Stanley. Would you like to share with us some of the things you've learned along the way? And I think in particular, what would interest people, James, is how an outsider, albeit with your family connections with New York, but they wouldn't necessarily see that. How did an outsider become such a quintessential New York insider like you are now?
Well, I actually don't know that I am a New York insider. I tend not to, how should I put this? I'm not very involved in the social scene in New York. I keep a very private life, have a very close relationship with my 2 kids. And I just haven't seen the commingling of sort of work and job at the level that many people at the top of the business community, certainly in the US and probably globally, do. So I've always been a little bit of an outsider, and I think that's in some ways an advantage.
Okay.
I mean, there are clear deficits. I'm not a trader. I'm not an investment banker. I've never taken a company public. I've never personally run an M&A transaction. I don't manage money. So all of the things that we do as a business, I've actually never done. So
Makes you a perfect chairman.
well, it sort of makes me think that what matters is not the specific knowledge of any one thing, because by definition, any CEO will not have knowledge of everything.
Yeah.
What matters is the overarching skill set that requires you to accumulate and to simplify complexity.
Yeah.
Is really at the heart of what I try and do. I try and take very complex problems and reduce them to their basics, and then draw the action steps and strategy from that.
Yeah.
So being an outsider, in some ways, you don't bring the baggage or the history or the biases, the prejudices. You know, people had, when we used to talk about Wall Street bonuses back 10 years ago, when it was a big fight about whether we should still pay bonuses when these companies were nearly going bankrupt. And, I was very clear about it. I said, well, if you keep paying the employee rich bonuses and you're not paying the shareholder anything, eventually they pick up their bat and ball and go home.
I reckon.
And given that we're paying the employees in stock, you're actually hurting yourself. So there were sort of some things which, as an outsider, I think you can see with more clarity than an insider. And Wall Street itself had never been run as businesses. They were private partnerships that converted to public companies and continue to behave like they're private partnerships. In fact, some of them still call themselves partnerships, which is misleading to say the least, because they're not partnerships. They're owned by shareholders.
Yeah, stock limited.
And, my focus and I guess my skill set was bringing, strategy and culture and discipline to organizations which were very flat organizations and didn't really like being told what to do. So there was a huge tension with that, but the end result, if you could get it right, was well worth it. So I think, honestly, Ian, being an outsider was a strength. Being an Australian, I lived in Hong Kong for a little bit, in Japan for a little bit, in Madrid for a little bit. So I've been, in the palaces in Riyadh. I've been in, the all over Russia. I mean, you've seen a lot of the world. So not coming from such a center where everybody believes everything they do there is right, but having seen the rest of the world, you bring a different perspective. So I think it's an advantage, to be honest.
Yeah, great. No, very, very good answer. I do want to come back to this point about strategy that you've raised, because I too noticed that was a real theme in what you've done. But before we do that, James, let's widen the lens a little bit here and talk about current circumstances, the geopolitical tensions that we're experiencing, supply chain issues, hyperinflation, climate change, the whole sort of pastiche of issues that we're all focused on. Well, of all of that long list of major challenges, what are the things that mostly you focus on, James? What do you think is the most important thing to be focused on in this juncture?
Well, I focus on what I can control. So I worry about other things, and if somebody asks me an opinion, I'll give them an opinion. I just did a little speech yesterday in London about what's going on geopolitically, but we're in a very unusual state. We've had a global pandemic, the first in 100 years. We've got global inflation level we haven't had in 40 years. We've got a global, I think, recession in most parts of the world. If we're not in it, we're going to be in it. And we've got political divisions that we probably haven't seen at least until the 60s, and arguably from the Second World War. So geopolitical, political, economic, and health crises all happening at once. I don't think that's ever happened before.
Yeah.
So it's an enormously complex time for anybody involved in a global business, and ours is about as global as you can get. So what I focus on is firstly to ensure that we're not out of step with our lords and masters, which is the US government. We're a US regulated bank. So we don't front end US policy or geopolicy. Secondly, that we keep our noses out of the day-to-day political debate and rhetoric and stridency. Our job is not to run politics. That's for the politicians to do and for the people to elect them. We get our vote and our opportunity to voice our opinion through our vote, but we don't do it simply because we have the job and we have a platform. So I stay out of a lot of day-to-day political issues. I focus on, during COVID, for example, we guaranteed every employee their job for 2 years in a row, 73,000 people. That's something I can actually control.
Yeah.
Is in a difficult time, do we downsize or do we support our people? Now, we're out of that difficult time and we right-size the business on a continuous basis as normal. But during those couple of years, every single person kept their job. But what I really focus on is to ensure we, generate a decent return for our shareholders, serve our clients during these very complex and difficult periods, and make sure that Morgan Stanley is a place our employees are proud to work at. They're my three, jobs, if you will.
Yeah.
And at different points in time, one or more of those will rise to the top. So during COVID, I was much more focused about employees than profitability. That the health issues clearly transcended any issues around whether we had an ROE of 15% or 12% or 14%. That was immaterial.
Yeah.
Now that we're through that, our job is to run the business as a world-class business. So that's really where I'm focusing my energy and making sure we don't have sort of catastrophic blow-ups that the geopolitical and political environment could create for you.
Well, to precisely that point, there are risks, as you put it, of blow-ups sort of on many fronts. And I'm just wondering if you're happy to share with the audience, are you sort of risk on or risk off in these circumstances? In other words, do you see, with all the risks around, that there are these opportunities that is now a good chance for us to take on some risks in certain areas, or like many others faced with these sorts of dangers, you pull your horns in? I mean, how do you manage the bank setting those sorts of priorities when you're really surrounded by snapping alligators?
Well, about September a year ago, I got our global management committee together, which is about 45 executives, and said it was impossible for me to see how the Fed didn't start rising interest rates. I didn't think the Ukraine war would have actually delayed it, but it did. And given that we were likely to have dislocation in the economy, given that business would be tougher, credit issues would arise, given that we should pull in our risk profile. So we did about a year and a quarter ago.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean you're completely risk on or risk off. You just moderate your positions. We run in $1 trillion balance sheet. We have $90+ billion of capital. We're operating in 40 countries around the world, and we manage just in wealth and asset management nearly $6 trillion of people's money. That would be, I don't know what the total wealth of all of Australia is, but the population of Australia, but I bet it's not 6 trillion. So we've got a huge set of responsibilities, and at any point in time, there's a client who wants to buy security and a client who wants to sell that security. So our job is not really to take risk in the traditional proprietary position, risk on our own behalf, but to intermediate. Basically, our job description is to be a conduit of capital flows between those who have it and those who need it.
Yeah.
You have people who are building companies and need investors. You have investors who want to put money to work. You have people saving money, and you have borrowers who need to build businesses and build properties and so on. So we basically work at the intersection of borrowers and savers, issuers and investors, those who have money and those who need money. So we don't actually have post-crisis the kind of risks that these banks had in the 2008 period, anything like it.
Yeah.
But that said, with dislocations in markets, you can be caught with your positioning on behalf of clients. You can underwrite a transaction that then doesn't get well distributed in the market and so on. So you're always running risk, but it's not at the level it was. So it's not binary on or off, it's moderated.
Okay. So on balance, let me ask you this. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future in the light of what you described as a set of circumstances which in some respects is unprecedented?
Well, I've for better or for worse, Ian, I've had a bit of newspaper coverage and media coverage in my career. And the only thing I've put on the wall in my office in New York is actually a front page of The Age in Melbourne. And it was shortly after September 11. I happened to be down in Melbourne visiting with my family, I think in October. So a month after the September 11 tragedy that hit New York and Washington and Pennsylvania. And I was interviewed by the press down there, and I said I was optimistic. And there's a glaring large headline saying Mr. Optimistic with my photo. The only problem with it is I look a lot younger than I look now, but it was 20 years ago, so that's okay. I can accept that. So no, I'm by personality, I'm optimistic, and the facts support that. If you have global demographic growth, global productivity improvement, business is going to keep growing. Doesn't mean individual companies will do well.
No.
So I'm by definition optimistic, but I'm a realist. In this environment, you've got to be realistic about the fact we're going through a restructuring of the global economies. As rates rise, unemployment will go up, inflation will come down. You'll have slower GDP growth, maybe negative GDP growth during this period, but we'll come out of it. I'm not concerned about the economic environment long term at all. Geopolitical, I'm actually not as concerned about that as most people are. I'm more concerned about the political ruptures of the extreme right and the extreme left dominating global politics. That is something which is very different, certainly in my lifetime.
Within the big democracies, right?
Correct.
Yeah, they're becoming much less stable and in some respects, governable. Yeah.
Yep.
So okay, well then, Mr. Optimistic, where are the opportunities? Or I mean, in broad terms, you say you're not concerned about the economic outlook. Some people do worry about the slowdown in demographic growth. And we've just passed 8 billion on the planet, but the rate of growth, of course, is falling dramatically. That's just one measure. But where do you see the opportunities, James, if that back up your optimistic outlook?
Well, there are always opportunities. I mean, there's again, you're creating businesses globally. I mean, you look at the interestingly, you look at the top 4 or 5 companies in the US 20 years ago, and they're Exxon, Walmart, probably AT&T, Citibank, GE, IBM, and then it became Facebook, Google, Alphabet, Apple. I mean, Microsoft. There's always change and transition. So I again, maybe I'm wrong, but my posture is never to be absolute in business. It's always relative to where you were and what are the opportunities given the economic environment. We had free money for a decade. That's artificial. People start to think that's what the real world's like. It's not like that at all. Money is not free. So now we haven't got free money, and it's a little higher than we'd all like, but that's okay. Rates will normalize after a while. So I'm very focused on great new companies, new ideas that you can bring. Look at Tesla. Tesla didn't exist 10 years ago. I mean, Amazon didn't exist 20 years ago. These are extraordinary platforms. So there's always the pace of innovation. What you've got to do is have a healthy capital system, venture capital, and then private equity capital, and then long-term permanent capital to support innovation.
Yep.
And we have that in the developed markets.
Yeah. Oh no, that makes a lot of sense to me. Let me bring you back to Australia, James. I don't know whether you've been watching the news, at least as it relates to our own country in the last little while with respect to the G20, but our Prime Minister has managed to pull off what I think many Australians consider to be quite a remarkable feat of shoring up our relationship with our major ally, of course, the United States, but having really an historic thawing interview with the Chinese Premier, Mr. Xi, and given Australia's position of obviously being very closely aligned with the United States on defense policy, and yet having the Chinese as our major trading partner, that can be a difficult and awkward place for us to be, as we've been experiencing. How do you see Australia fitting into this broader picture that you've been describing? And in particular, do you think that we are really fortunate to be where we are, as some people say, or are we uniquely challenged by our relationship and location alongside or very near the Chinese?
Well, Australia is incredibly fortunate. I remember many years ago, one of the treasurers, and it wasn't Peter Costello, who I think is following me here, and was a great treasurer, one of the other treasurers, who I won't name, telling me in New York how clever Australians were, how clever Australia was, and look at all the business they were doing with the Chinese. This was after Australia stopped selling iron ore to the Japanese when the Japanese economy cratered, and then Paul Keating came out and said we're at risk of being a banana republic. He was a truth teller at the time.
Yeah.
And basically along came China's growth and the opening of China, which was the greatest gift that could have been given. Anyway, this treasurer kept telling me how clever Australia was. And I said, yeah, clever enough to be placed next to China and not in South America. I mean, just think of the transportation costs. So you've got to approach this with a little bit of humility. Australia's an unbelievable country. What it's done is diversified away from an agricultural mineral economy in ways that a lot of other countries have not been able to do.
Yeah.
And it's built up its education sector spectacularly well, tourism, financial innovation. Australia has several legs it's now standing on. But yes, it's very fortunate to be near China. It's more fortunate to have a lot of minerals under the ground that the rest of the world that is developing needs.
Yeah.
The question is, how do you navigate that? And that's really at the heart of what you're asking. And I think, listen, Australia has had the ANZUS alliance with the US and New Zealand for a long time, and thank God.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an awfully good partner to pick if you've got to have a partner in this world. And the Chinese-US relationship will have skirmishes, I think, but not wars. I think the next several years, you're going to see a series of, and as we have the last couple of decades, sort of eruptions, disputes, whether it was Nancy Pelosi choosing to visit Taiwan, whether it's the Chinese, putting an embargo, I guess, on restricting Australian, wine. They didn't restrict iron ore, by the way.
Oh, no.
So whether it's, the reaction of the Chinese when the US expanded their base in Darwin, all of these will play out, and Australia in some ways might be a bit of a proxy in these disputes. But listen, Australia has to figure out how to be both a good partner, but not a dependency. A good partner that is an independent thinker.
Yeah.
And yes, that's a little nuanced, and I congratulate the Prime Minister for making these steps. You're always better engaging rather than disengaging.
Yeah.
You're always better speaking in professional language rather than, strident rhetoric. And I think this is, the test is, how does Australia maintain its wonderful partnerships it has, not just with the US, but with the UK and Europe.
Yeah.
At the same time, be a good trading partner and be an engaged partner with the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Those parts of the world we want to trade with. We don't want to trade with North Korea, with Iran, with Russia, etc. But we do with plenty of other countries, some of which happen to be autocracies, some of which happen to be run by communist parties.
Yeah. Yeah, fair enough. Let me come back to this discussion we started earlier, James, about strategy and the importance of that, not just in your career, but as you've built organizations. I want to ask two questions about strategy. Firstly, how does a company and how do you keep Morgan Stanley focused on the bigger strategic questions while running the organization day to day? How do you manage that tension? And when do you know when the strategy needs to change?
Well, I think one of the hardest things as a chief executive to do is to do exactly what you asked, how to focus on the day-to-day, but keep a strategic vision. I've described it, rather cutely as I manage my job through 3 sheets of paper. Every night before I go to bed, I write down by hand our numbers for our businesses from all over the world. And I've done that now I've been doing this job for nearly 13 years, 252 business days or whatever it is a year. So I guess I'm over about 3,000 nights I've done that. And I don't think I've ever missed. So I have a very good handle every morning of exactly how we're positioned relative to our expectations, our estimates, our forecasts, and so on. It's a little maniacal, but that's how I stay on top of things. And then I can reach out to different parts of the company and inquire as to why things were going on the way they're going on. Why did we make this much money in rates trading in Japan last time? Things of that nature. So it keeps you a very tactile feel. We could do it through, obviously I could get endless spreadsheets from our finance group, but I like to touch the numbers because that helps me touch the business. Every year on the first day I come in, I get a blank sheet of paper and write down 10 things I want to do that year to move Morgan Stanley forward. So this moves in from the daily to sort of tactical strategy. It might be talent driven, develop these kinds of these couple of executives. It might be geographic, open an office in this region. It might be strategic, sell the physical commodities business we had in oil shipping, for example. It could be anything. It might be personal, maintain a level of personal fitness, a test that I give myself every year. So each of these are, what does it take for me to add value to Morgan Stanley over a 12-month period? I need to get stuff done, not just think about things and not just worry about day-to-day numbers, but actually move the needle with some big things.
Yeah.
And then on strategy, a third sheet of paper I keep on my desk is simply a description of what our strategy is. And it's essentially what I said. We're a conduit of the flow of capital between those who have it and those who need it. We originate, manage, and distribute that capital. And we do it for governments, we do it for pension funds, corporations, and individuals. So every time somebody comes up with an idea of something we should do, I say, how does that fit in our strategy? If it doesn't, we either change our strategy or we don't do it.
Have you changed the strategy? Because you pull that out, and it seems like an absolutely, it's essential way to describe what your organization does. But people do change strategies. Sounds like that one hasn't changed.
The core hasn't changed. Some of the emphasis within it has changed dramatically. So, for example, intermediating the flow of capital between individuals has gone from being, 10-15% of Morgan Stanley to nearly 50%.
Yeah, right.
We're now the largest manager of individual wealth. I think we and UBS, I'm not sure who's bigger, but we're both enormous in the world. That was a small business for Morgan Stanley. But a lot of things we had to change in order to get that position. If you're intermediating the flow of capital, you're not owning proprietary businesses. So we sold and closed, I don't know, probably a dozen businesses in my first few years in the job to clarify that we weren't at the strategic point that I'd laid out. That was developed 10 years ago, but it took about 10 years to get there. Now, I would say, obviously, technology is underpinning a lot more of what we do now than what we did 10 years ago, understandably.
Sure. That makes sense. That makes perfect sense. So just rounding that one out, I mean, a lot of our businesses here in Australia, as you know, particularly the ones that are export-oriented, outward-facing, are looking into these extremely volatile international markets. As a strategy expert, James, what sort of general advice would you give to people who are running these organizations? I mean, apart from your 3 sheets of paper, which sounds like a very sensible way to go about things, is there general strategic insight that you could share from your experience at using this tool in your own corporate life?
Well, every business faces catastrophic risk. There are things which, if they were to happen, would materially and potentially totally destroy your business. Obviously, within banks, it's largely built around liquidity. So in a difficult period of time, it behooves every executive to sit back and consider their weak points, their underbellies. And what are they doing to protect, insure, or hedge the risk that something, were it to happen, would materially damage, if not destroy, their business. Once you've figured that out and you take that risk off the table, which is much more heightened in troubled economic circumstances than not, everybody looks smart when things are going well. But once you've figured that out, then the other part of what you need to do strategically is step back and say, what are the opportunities that have come from this crisis? There are always going to be competitors. If you rank 10 competitors in an industry, somebody's number 1, somebody's number 10. If you're number 1, 2, or 3, what can you do about 8, 9, and 10? You'd be looking at consolidating those, at pressing your advantage, at building more scale in your business. Because somebody else has funding issues, they have profitability issues, their stock is trading very poorly, whatever the situation that is causing their weakness, how do you take advantage of that? So the challenge, Ian, is during times like this to carry in your head a very conservative posture, which is absolutely guarantee that whatever comes through that door we will be fine.
Yeah.
At the same time, don't get so caught up in the drama of the moment that you lose the ability to think 10 years in advance and to say, oh my God, I wish back then we'd done that. That was, what were we thinking?
Yeah, yeah.
I'll give you an example. Right after the financial crisis, Morgan Stanley nearly disappeared in October of 2008. We're probably 2 days away from it. In November of 2008, I walked into my boss's office, then John Mack, and told him I had an idea for us to buy Smith Barney from Citigroup.
Yeah.
That was the largest still, I think, financial transaction being done by any bank in the world since the 08 crisis. And we did it 1 month after the 08 crisis. And everybody said, you must be crazy. You guys nearly went under. Yeah. But from my perspective, we had then solved the catastrophic risk through an investment we took through Mitsubishi Bank in Japan. So we'd solved that problem. Now we needed to look aggressively at who else had issues.
Yep.
And we saw an opportunity to buy this business from Citigroup, and it came at an inconvenient time, but strategy doesn't come, you know, if strategy always came along at a nice, convenient time, every idiot would be able to do it.
It wouldn't be strategy, right?
No, you've got the opportunity is to see things others don't see.
Yeah.
To be bold when others are scared.
Yeah.
And to see I try and think in 10-year increments strategically, 10 and 20 years, not 1 and 2 years.
Yeah. Yep. Well, one thing, James, has been remarkably successful for you in doing exactly that, and that's a wonderful example there. James, as we bring this to a close, one of the things that we traditionally do with the Charles Good Oration is to give Mr. Good the opportunity to ask a question. And normally Charles does, of course, himself from the floor, but I'm going to ask it on his behalf tonight. And Charles has asked James what you made of the market's reaction to the UK budget announcements under the former UK PM and Chancellor, and what lessons you drew from that experience.
Fiscal policy, monetary policy, and market behavior are not disconnected. The worst thing you can do as a new leader is surprise the market. It's one thing to have rhetoric on a political, out when you're doing your political campaign. It's another thing to deal with the reality of the real world. And I thought that was a classic rookie error. They came out too aggressively, disconnected with no expectation setting from the market, and the market reacted very badly. And the monetary authority, in this case, the Bank of England under Andrew Bailey, stepped in. But he stepped in an interesting and very brave way where he said, we will support it, but only up until this day. I think he named a day, like Friday week.
Yeah.
So he said, you've got air cover to that time, but fix it or we're out and then you'll be out, was basically his message.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happened. So listen, you can't make fiscal, whether you like the markets or not. A lot of people think in terms of the market, oh, it's Wall Street. It's like, all these fancy traders and bankers and all this stuff. You got to put aside the biases. The markets are basically, again, the flow of money through all the systems in the world. If we didn't have markets, the economy wouldn't function. And that proved it. When you have a government that gets out ahead of where the market is, it will create a crisis. And, the lesson is be thoughtful about not just what policy you want to put in place, but what policy the economy can sustain.
Yep. You got to carry the people with you, and in particular when the people have got the money. James, I know that Charles was very excited when we announced that we'd managed to get you to agree to be our orator this year for the Charles Good Oration, and I'm sure that I speak on behalf of our audience when I say what a wonderful thing it's been to be able to share just this brief time with you, unpacking these insights. You've got a unique position from which you view the world, as we've been discussing, and I know how much our audience really values that. We're hoping, of course, at some future time that you will see you in the flesh rather than doing what we've been doing this evening, but relative to the alternative, not having the opportunity, it's been great. So James, on our collective behalf, may I thank you for giving us the benefit of your time, first and foremost, but obviously your insights and your willingness to participate in this conversation. So on behalf of Charles Good and our audience, thank you very much indeed.
Great. Well, thank you, Ian. Thanks for having us. And thank you, Charles. I have enormous respect for Charles as a person and obviously as a businessman. So I was delighted to have the honor of addressing you. Thank you for giving me that honor. Sorry, I'm not there in person. I plan to be in Australia in around Easter time. So I'll come by the university for sure. But, you know, my one final piece of advice to everybody is we've had challenges before. You know, we deal with them. We manage through, and you've got to think through and look through the fog and the clouds and the turmoil and the stress, and just dial your heartbeat down a little bit and imagine what the world will be like 10 years from now, not a year from now. And if you can do that, you generally come out ahead.
Terrific. Thank you very much, James.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks for having us. Bye-bye.